Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Crawford County, Kansas. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know in which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the spring of 1909, a small mining settlement along Bone Creek became the center of events that would challenge investigators for decades to come, leaving behind questions that persist even in the present day. The case involves the disappearance of 17 children under circumstances that defy conventional explanation and suggest forces that operate beyond the boundaries of accepted science. Crawford County, in 1909, was a landscape defined by coal. The region, part of what locals called the Little Balkans due to the influx of Eastern European immigrants who came to work the mines, bore little resemblance to the flat prairies most associated with Kansas. Here, the terrain rolled and dipped, carved by countless creeks and streams that fed into the larger waterways. Bone Creek itself wound through a narrow valley approximately 8 miles northeast of Pittsburgh, the county seat, cutting a path through limestone formations that had been exposed by centuries of erosion. The creek derived its name from the unusually pale rocks along its banks, which in certain light appeared skeletal, though some older residents insisted the name originated from something discovered there long before white settlement. The coal mining operations that dominated Crawford County by this time employed nearly 7,000 men across more than 60 active shaft mines. The work was brutal and unforgiving. Men descended into darkness each morning with no guarantee they would see daylight again. Explosions from coal dust or methane gas claimed lives regularly. Cave-ins buried miners alive. The worst disaster in Kansas history had occurred just 20 years earlier in Frontenac, when an explosion at Mine No. 2 killed 44 men and boys in a single horrific moment. The immigrants who made up the bulk of the mining workforce, arriving from countries like Croatia, Poland, Slovenia, and Italy, found themselves trapped in a cycle of dangerous labor with minimal pay and even less protection. The settlement that concerns our account bore no official name. On contemporary maps, it appeared simply as a cluster of structures along Bone Creek, though miners referred to it as Hollow Camp, or sometimes just the Hollow. The camp consisted of roughly 30 wooden structures built by the Western Coal and Mining Company to house workers at a nearby shaft known as Mine 17. The buildings were constructed hastily and cheaply, simple frame structures with tar paper roofs and walls so thin that conversations in one dwelling could be heard clearly in the next. 43 families lived in the Hollow as of March 1909, representing a population of approximately 215 souls. Among these were 53 children under the age of 14. The winter of 1908 to 1909 had been particularly harsh. According to weather records maintained by the Kansas State Agricultural College, Crawford County received more than twice its average snowfall between December and February, with temperatures frequently dropping below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. The coal mines ran at full capacity to meet heating demands, meaning the men of the Hollow worked longer shifts with fewer days of rest. Children saw their fathers only briefly. Exhausted men who came home covered in coal dust ate quickly and collapsed into sleep before rising in darkness to return underground. Bone Creek, which normally ran shallow enough to wade across during summer months, swelled with snowmelt as March temperatures began to rise. The Pittsburgh Headlight newspaper noted on March 8th that creeks throughout the county were running high, and that several low water crossings had become impassable. This was not unusual for spring, and while the residents of the hollow kept watchful eyes on the rising water, there was no particular alarm. The settlement sat on ground elevated some 20 feet above the creek's normal level, which had always seemed adequate protection. What makes the events that followed particularly disturbing is that they began not with the flood itself, but with changes observed in the children of the hollow during the weeks preceding it. The first documented account comes from Sister Mary Perpetua, a Benedictine nun who operated a small school in a converted mining building approximately 2 miles from the hollow. In a letter dated February 24th and addressed to the Mother Superior of her order in Atchison, Kansas, Sister Mary Perpetua wrote of troubling behaviors among her students from the mining camp. She described how 7 children, ranging in age from 6 to 12, had become suddenly withdrawn and distracted. They would stare for long periods toward the windows facing the direction of Bone Creek. When questioned about their inattention, the children gave answers that Sister Mary Perpetua found deeply unsettling. According to her letter, one girl named Magdalena Kovac, age 9, told her that she could hear singing coming from beneath the ground. The girl described it as many voices together, children's voices, singing in a language she did not recognize. When Sister Mary Perpetua asked if this singing frightened her, Magdalena replied that it did not, that the voices were calling to her and to the others, and that they wanted to show them something wonderful beneath the water. Another student, a boy named Tomasz Nowak, age 11, drew pictures during his lessons that depicted figures standing at the bottom of a creek bed. These figures appeared to be children, though Sister Mary Perpetua noted in her letter that the proportions were somehow wrong, the limbs too long, the heads oddly shaped. Most disturbingly, Tomasz had drawn these underwater children with their mouths open as if calling out or singing. Sister Mary Perpetua's letter concluded with a request for guidance on how to address what she termed influences of an unwholesome nature affecting her students. She mentioned that she had spoken with some of the parents, all of whom were struggling to communicate in limited English, and that they had dismissed her concerns. The mine work occupied all their attention. Children's stories and strange drawings did not seem significant compared to the daily struggle for survival in the camp. The Mother Superior's response, if one was sent, has not been preserved in church archives. A second source from this period comes from Dr. Harold Pemberton, a physician who served the mining camps of southeastern Crawford County on a rotating basis. Dr. Pemberton maintained detailed notes on his patients, and his journal from March 1909 records several visits to the hollow. On March 2nd, he was called to examine a child named Elena Petrovich, age 7, who had fallen into what her mother described as a waking sleep. The girl's eyes remained open, but she did not respond to voices or touch. Dr. Pemberton noted that her pulse and breathing were normal, her pupils reactive to light, yet she remained completely unresponsive for nearly 3 hours before suddenly awakening with no memory of the episode. 2 days later, Dr. Pemberton returned to treat another child exhibiting identical symptoms, then another. By March 10th, he had documented 8 separate cases of this peculiar condition, all occurring in children from the hollow, all lasting between 2 and 4 hours before spontaneous recovery. In his notes, Dr. Pemberton speculated about environmental causes, perhaps gases escaping from the nearby mine shaft that might affect developing nervous systems. He wrote that he intended to contact the state mine inspector to investigate whether dangerous vapors were reaching the surface in concentrations sufficient to cause neurological effects. The weather pattern shifted dramatically on March 14th. A slow-moving storm system settled over southeastern Kansas, bringing not snow, but cold, steady rain. The Pittsburgh Headlight reported on March 15th that more than 3 inches had fallen in 24 hours, and that the deluge showed no signs of abating. Bone Creek, already swollen from snowmelt, began to rise at an alarming rate. By the morning of March 16th, the water had climbed to within 5 feet of its banks at the hollow. Several men attempted to leave for their shifts at Mine 17, but found the access road had become a river of mud, impassable for the wagons that normally transported workers. The mine superintendent, a man named Charles Wickham, decided to suspend operations until the roads dried, which meant the families of the hollow found themselves trapped together in the camp, waiting out the storm. What occurred during the next 36 hours has been reconstructed from the testimonies of the adult survivors, though their accounts contain significant inconsistencies and gaps. The most detailed statement came from Maria Kovac, mother of Magdalena, who testified before a coroner's inquest held on April 2nd. According to Mrs. Kovac, speaking through an interpreter, the rain continued throughout the day on March 16th, growing heavier as evening approached. The children of the camp, who normally would have been scattered across the settlement in their individual homes, began to gather together in small groups. At first, the adults paid this little attention. Children seeking company during a storm seemed natural enough, but as darkness fell, Mrs. Kovac noticed that the children had all moved to the eastern side of the settlement, the side closest to Bone Creek. They stood in the rain, perhaps 20 or 30 of them, ranging in age from 4 years old to 13, simply standing and staring toward the water. She called to her daughter Magdalena to come inside, but the girl did not respond or even turn her head. Other parents emerged from their homes and likewise attempted to summon their children. None of the children reacted. They continued to stand motionless in the downpour, their clothes soaked through, water streaming down their faces. Several fathers approached the group and physically took their children by the arms to lead them back to shelter. According to multiple witnesses, the children's eyes remained fixed on the creek, their bodies stiff and resistant. Once brought inside, the children would not speak. They did not cry or protest. They simply stood near windows and doors, still staring in the direction of Bone Creek, which by now was a churning torrent clearly visible even in darkness due to the foam and debris caught in its current. Joseph Kowalski, a miner originally from Poland, gave a statement to the Crawford County Sheriff describing how his 2 sons, ages 8 and 10, stood at the door of their home for hours, despite his orders to move away and go to bed. When he attempted to physically restrain them, his wife told him to leave the boys alone, that perhaps they were ill with the same condition Dr. Pemberton had been treating. Kowalski recalled checking on his sons several times during the night, finding them always in the same position, standing and staring, neither asleep nor awake in any normal sense. The storm reached its peak intensity near midnight on March 16th. According to measurements taken by the Western Coal and Mining Company, whose offices kept rain gauges, more than 7 inches had fallen in the 48 hours since the storm's beginning. Bone Creek was now far beyond its banks, spreading across the valley floor. The water had risen to within 8 feet of the settlement's closest structures. Some families began to discuss evacuation, but the darkness and the condition of the surrounding terrain made travel extremely dangerous. The consensus was to wait for daylight Between midnight and 1 o'clock in the morning of March 17th, something changed. Multiple witnesses reported that the sound of the storm, which had been a constant roar of rain and wind, suddenly diminished, not stopped, but muffled, as if heard through a thick barrier. Into this relative quiet came another sound, one that would feature prominently in every subsequent testimony. It was described variously as singing, chanting, or calling. Most witnesses agreed it seemed to come from the direction of the creek, beneath or behind the sound of rushing water. Several testified that the sound was definitely voices, children's voices, and that they were singing in harmony, though the words were incomprehensible. Maria Kovac stated that upon hearing this sound, her daughter, Magdalena, and all the other children who had been standing vigilant throughout the evening moved simultaneously. They opened doors and walked out into the storm, moving toward the flooded creek. Parents rushed after them. Some caught their children and dragged them back. Others found their children too strong, struggling with a force that seemed impossible for young bodies to generate. Mrs. Kovac managed to restrain Magdalena only by wrapping both arms around her daughter and pulling her to the ground. Even then, the girl continued trying to crawl toward the water, her eyes still fixed in that direction, her mouth moving as if singing along with the voices that came from the creek. But not all parents succeeded in restraining their children. 17 children broke free and ran toward Bone Creek. They covered the distance of roughly 100 yards in seconds, running through mud and standing water with an urgency that suggested desperate purpose rather than aimless wandering. Parents followed, shouting and weeping, several men carrying lanterns that illuminated the scene in lurching fragments of light. The children reached the edge of the swollen creek, where the water churned dark and violent, carrying uprooted trees and debris in its current. And then, according to every witness who was close enough to see clearly, the children walked into the water. Not jumped, not fell, but walked calmly forward as if descending steps, their arms at their sides, their expressions serene. The water closed over them instantly. Several fathers waded in after them, fighting the current, searching desperately for small bodies to grab and pull to safety. They found nothing. The creek was perhaps 12 feet deep at its channel in that location, moving with tremendous force. Within seconds, any child swept away would have been carried downstream, possibly pushed underwater by the current, possibly dashed against rocks or submerged debris. The chaos that followed consumed the rest of the night. Every able-bodied person in the settlement joined the search. They worked their way along both banks of the creek for miles, lanterns and torches, creating a desperate constellation of lights moving through the darkness. They called names until their voices gave out. They waded into every accessible pool and shallow stretch as dawn broke on March the 17th, revealing a gray world still lashed by rain. They had found nothing, no bodies, no clothing, no evidence that 17 children had vanished into Bone Creek 7 hours earlier. News of the tragedy reached Pittsburgh by mid-morning on March the 17th. Sheriff Thomas Hayward immediately organized a larger search party, bringing deputies and volunteers who knew the creek's course for 20 miles downstream. The search continued for 5 days, examining every bank, sandbar, and pool where bodies might have lodged. Dr. Pemberton accompanied the searchers, hoping his medical expertise might help identify remains. The Pittsburgh Headlight devoted its entire front page on March 18th to the disaster, running the headline, "17 Children Lost to Floodwaters at Mining Camp." By March 22nd, when the search was officially called off, not a single body had been recovered. Sheriff Hayward, in his official report filed with the county, noted that while flooding deaths were tragically common, the complete absence of remains was highly unusual. Bodies might travel considerable distances in flood conditions, but they typically surfaced within a few days as decomposition gases caused them to rise. The sheriff's report mentioned the possibility that the children had been swept all the way to the Neosho River, some 30 miles distant, though even this would not account for 0 recoveries. The coroner's inquest, held on April 2nd, attempted to establish an official cause of death and to determine if any negligence had contributed to the tragedy. The hearing was conducted by County Coroner Dr. Samuel Blackwood and attended by parents of the missing children, representatives from the Western Coal and Mining Company, Sheriff Hayward, Dr. Pemberton, and several other witnesses. The interpreter present to translate for the non-English-speaking parents was a man named Vincent Marinelli, who had worked in the mining camps for 15 years and spoke several Slavic languages fluently. The testimony given at the inquest raised more questions than it answered. Every parent who spoke described the strange behavior of the children in the weeks leading up to their disappearance, the episodes of unresponsiveness, the fixation on the creek, the talk of voices singing beneath the water. Dr. Pemberton presented his medical notes documenting the peculiar trance-like states he had observed. Sister Mary Perpetua was called to testify about the changes she had witnessed in her students' behavior and the disturbing drawings produced by Tomasz Nowak, several of which she brought as evidence. When asked by Dr. Blackwood to describe these drawings in detail, Sister Mary Perpetua explained that they showed figures at the bottom of a creek or river, clearly underwater, based on the way fish and aquatic plants were drawn around them. The figures were child-sized but elongated, with arms and legs that seemed too long for their torsos. Their heads were tilted back and their mouths open. Around them, Tomasz had drawn smaller figures meant to represent living children walking down into the water toward these waiting forms. Sister Mary Perpetua stated that when she had asked Tomasz what the drawings meant, he told her they were showing what would happen when the water rose, when the children beneath would finally be able to reach up and take the children above back down where they belonged. This testimony caused considerable disturbance in the hearing room. Several parents began shouting, though whether in grief or anger was difficult to determine. Dr. Blackwood called for order and asked Sister Mary Perpetua if she had reported these statements to any authority before the tragedy occurred. She replied that she had written to her Mother Superior, but had received no response before the flood. She had considered approaching the sheriff but had hesitated, believing she might be overreacting to children's fantasies. Charles Wickham, the mine superintendent, testified about conditions at Mine 17 in the weeks before the flood. He stated categorically that no dangerous gases had been detected and that ventilation systems were functioning properly. When Dr. Pemberton suggested that previously unknown gas emissions might have affected the children neurologically, Wickham dismissed this as unsupported speculation. The company's safety record, he insisted, was exemplary, and no geological factors could account for the alleged behavioral changes. The most disturbing testimony came near the end of the inquest from a man named Dragan Petrovich, father of the 7-year-old Elena, who had been one of Dr. Pemberton's patients. Mr. Petrovich, speaking through the interpreter, described something that he claimed to have witnessed but had been afraid to mention to the search parties. On the night of March 15th, the evening before the children's disappearance, he had gone outside his home near midnight to check on the rising water. As he stood at the edge of the settlement looking toward the creek, he saw lights beneath the surface. Not reflections, he insisted, but lights originating from underwater, moving slowly along the creek bed. They were greenish in color and seemed to pulse rhythmically. As he watched, the lights moved upstream against the current before fading from view. Mr. Petrovich stated that he had mentioned these lights to his wife, who told him he had been seeing reflections from lanterns in other homes. He had accepted this explanation at the time, but now, after losing his daughter, he felt compelled to report what he had seen. When asked by Dr. Blackwood if anyone else had witnessed these lights, Mr. Petrovich said he did not know, but that 2 other men had been outside at approximately the same time and might have seen them as well. These men, when located and questioned, provided contradictory accounts. One said he had seen nothing unusual. The other admitted to seeing strange glows in the water, but attributed them to phosphorescent algae or decaying organic matter, both known to produce light under certain conditions. The coroner's inquest concluded on April 3rd with a verdict of accidental death by drowning for all 17 children. The formal finding stated that the children had, for reasons that could not be medically determined, entered a psychological state that led them to walk into floodwaters, resulting in their deaths. The verdict noted the absence of recovered bodies, but stated that the violence of the flood and the distance potentially traveled by remains made recovery unlikely. No blame was assigned to any individual or company. The case was officially closed, but the story was far from over. The families of the Hollow, devastated by the loss of their children, began to abandon the settlement within weeks. Many could not bear to remain in the place where their sons and daughters had vanished. The Western Coal and Mining Company, faced with labor shortages at Mine 17, relocated the remaining families to other camps and eventually dismantled the structures at the Hollow. By June of 1909, the settlement was essentially deserted. The buildings were torn down for salvage lumber, leaving only bare foundations and the scars of human habitation. Yet reports of strange occurrences along that stretch of Bone Creek continued throughout the summer and into the following year. The Pittsburgh Headlight published a brief article on August 7, 1909, noting that several fishermen had reported hearing children's voices singing near the site of the former mining camp, always at dusk or after dark, always seeming to come from the water itself. A group of boys from Pittsburgh who went to investigate claimed they had seen figures moving beneath the surface of a deep pool, child-sized shapes that swam against the current with unnatural ease before disappearing into the murky depths. In October of 1909, Dr. Pemberton returned to the area to conduct his own investigation. His notes from this period, preserved in the historical collection at Pittsburgh State University, reveal a man struggling to maintain scientific objectivity while confronting phenomena that defied rational explanation. He spent 3 nights camping near the creek, attempting to document anything unusual. On the second night, according to his detailed account, he heard the singing that others had reported. He described it as harmonious and definitely produced by young voices, perhaps a dozen or more singing together. The language was unknown to him, but the melody had a repetitive, almost hypnotic quality. Most disturbingly, Dr. Pemberton noted that several times during the singing he heard specific names called out in English, names he recognized as belonging to children who had disappeared in March. Dr. Pemberton attempted to approach the source of the singing, which seemed to originate from a pool approximately 50 yards downstream from where the children had entered the water. As he drew closer, the singing stopped abruptly. He reported that the night, which had been filled with the usual sounds of insects and night birds, became absolutely silent. Then he felt what he described as an overwhelming compulsion to enter the water, a pull so strong that he found himself walking toward the creek's edge with no conscious decision to do so. He managed to stop himself only by gripping a tree trunk and forcing himself to turn away. The compulsion faded after several minutes, leaving him shaken and nauseated. In his notes, Dr. Pemberton wrote that he could not in good conscience attribute what he experienced to natural causes. He speculated about mass hysteria affecting the mining community, about psychological contagion that might explain the children's behavior and subsequent delusions among adults. But he admitted these explanations felt inadequate. Something in that place, he wrote, exerted an influence that operated outside the boundaries of accepted science. He recommended that the area be avoided, particularly by children, and that county authorities consider posting warnings along that stretch of creek. No warnings were posted. The official position remained that 17 children had drowned in a tragic accident, and any subsequent reports of unusual phenomena were dismissed as grief-induced delusions or the overactive imaginations of superstitious immigrants who had brought their old-world beliefs to Kansas. The case faded from public attention as other disasters and concerns occupied the community. Mine accidents continued to claim lives. Labor disputes erupted into violence. The world moved forward, as it always does, leaving the missing children of Bone Creek as a footnote in county records. But the story found new life in 1928, when a graduate student from the University of Kansas named Robert Ashworth conducted research on immigrant folklore in southeastern Kansas. Ashworth, working on a thesis in anthropology, spent several months interviewing older residents of Crawford County's mining communities. Several of his subjects mentioned the Bone Creek incident, and Ashworth became intrigued by the consistency of certain details across multiple accounts. He managed to locate and interview 4 people who had been adults at the Hollow in 1909 and who had witnessed the children's disappearance firsthand. These interviews, preserved in Ashworth's thesis and later published in expanded form in the Kansas Historical Quarterly in 1932, provided additional details not included in the original coroner's inquest. One interviewee, a woman identified only as Mrs. K., described how, in the days following the disappearance, some parents reported seeing their lost children standing at the edges of the old settlement at night, visible for just moments before vanishing. Another subject, identified as Mr. N., stated that he had returned to the site alone one evening in late April of 1909 and had seen his daughter standing in the creek, the water up to her waist, her face pale and expressionless. When he rushed toward her, she sank beneath the surface as if she had never been there. Most significantly, Ashworth uncovered a detail that had not appeared in any official documents. According to 2 of his subjects, local Native American elders from the Osage tribe, which had inhabited the region before white settlement, warned the mining company against building structures in that particular location. The warnings, conveyed through intermediaries, spoke of the valley along Bone Creek as a place where the boundary between the living world and another realm grew thin, particularly during times of high water. The Osage called it a place where the drowned children waited, spirits of young ones who had perished in floods over countless generations, calling out to the living to join them in their eternal waters. The mining company, according to Ashworth sources, had dismissed these warnings as primitive superstition and proceeded with construction of the camp. Whether there was any historical truth to Osage traditions about the location could not be verified. Ashworth attempted to locate Osage informants who might provide additional information, but found that surviving tribal members in the area were unwilling to discuss the matter with outsiders. One elderly Osage man told Ashworth only that white people had been warned and had not listened, and that what happened was what always happened when the old warnings were ignored. Ashworth's thesis raised uncomfortable questions about the official narrative. He argued that dismissing the incident as a simple drowning accident ignored too much contradictory evidence. The systematic behavioral changes in the children over several weeks, the apparent coordination of their actions on the night of the flood, the complete absence of recovered bodies, and the persistent reports of anomalous phenomena at the location in subsequent years. He stopped short of proposing supernatural explanations, but suggested that unknown environmental or psychological factors might have been at work, factors that 19th and early 20th century science was not equipped to identify or understand. The publication of Ashworth's work generated brief renewed interest in the case. The Pittsburgh Morning Sun ran a retrospective article on the 20th anniversary of the disappearances in March 1929. Several readers wrote letters to the editor claiming personal experiences with strange occurrences near Bone Creek. One letter, from a man who had been part of the original search party, described how, on the third day of searching, he and two other men had seen children's footprints in the mud along the creek bank, fresh prints that appeared while they were searching that area, despite no living children being present. When they followed the tracks, they led directly into the water and did not emerge on the opposite bank. During the 1930s, as the Great Depression devastated mining employment and Crawford County's population declined, the area around the former hollow site became increasingly isolated. Mine 17 closed permanently in 1934. The roads leading to that section of Bone Creek fell into disrepair. The land reverted to a wild state, and few people had reason to venture there. Those who did, according to scattered reports in local newspapers, continued to describe unsettling experiences. Strange lights in the water, voices singing in unknown languages, the sensation of being watched or called to from beneath the creek's surface. In May of 1951, the same devastating flood that destroyed much of Topeka and other Kansas communities brought record-high water to Crawford County. Bone Creek, swollen beyond any previously recorded level, scoured its valley down to bedrock in places. In the aftermath, county work crews surveying flood damage discovered something in a deep pool near the site of the old hollow settlement. Embedded in limestone at the pool's bottom were carved symbols and what appeared to be deliberate depressions or wells approximately 3 feet deep. The carvings were weathered and ancient, clearly created long before modern times. A brief description appeared in the Pittsburgh Morning Sun on June 2, 1951, noting that county officials believed the carvings might be of Native American origin and that representatives from the Kansas State Historical Society would examine them. No follow-up articles ever appeared. Inquiries to the Kansas State Historical Society by later researchers have produced no records of any examination being conducted. The identity and purpose of the carvings remain undocumented in any official capacity. Robert Ashworth, who by then was a professor at the University of Kansas, attempted to visit the site, but found that post-flood erosion had refilled the pool with sediment, making the carvings inaccessible without extensive excavation. No such excavation was ever undertaken. The 1960s and 70s saw Crawford County's mining industry essentially vanish, replaced by attempts to establish the region as a manufacturing center with mixed success. The old mining camps disappeared entirely. their locations marked only by subtle changes in vegetation patterns and occasional debris from long demolished structures. Bone Creek became a recreational area for fishing and hiking, though the stretch near the former hollow remained less visited than other sections. Local residents, particularly those whose families had deep roots in the mining communities, continued to regard that area with suspicion, if not outright avoidance. In 1987, a group of students from Pittsburgh State University conducted a paranormal investigation along Bone Creek as part of a psychology class project on folklore and belief. The students, equipped with audio recording devices and cameras, spent 2 nights camping near the site of the old settlement. Their recordings, later analyzed by their professor, captured anomalous sounds that resisted easy explanation. One recording clearly contained what sounded like multiple children singing in harmony for approximately 45 seconds. Technical analysis confirmed that the sounds were present on the magnetic tape and were not the result of equipment malfunction or interference from radio signals. The melody matched descriptions given in historical accounts, and several phrases seemed to include the names of children who had vanished in 1909, though the audio quality made definitive identification impossible. More disturbing was a photograph taken by one of the students at approximately 3 in the morning. The image shows a section of the creek's surface illuminated by camera flash. In the water, clearly visible despite the murky conditions, appear to be 4 or 5 small faces looking upward toward the surface. The student who took the photograph stated that she had seen movement in the water and had photographed it reflexively, not consciously registering what she was seeing until the image was developed. Skeptics argued the faces were patterns of light and shadow, the mind imposing familiar forms on random visual data. Others noted that the faces, regardless of their origin, bore an uncanny resemblance to several of the children whose school photographs had been preserved in Sister Mary Perpetua's records and were later archived at the County Historical Society. The investigation resulted in several students experiencing psychological distress. 2 reported recurring nightmares involving drowning. 1 became obsessed with the case, dropping out of school to pursue independent research into the disappearances. The project was discontinued, and the professor who supervised it declined to allow similar investigations in subsequent years. In 1996, the Bone Creek Valley was dammed to create a reservoir for municipal water supply. The lake that formed flooded the entire area where the hollow once stood, submerging it under approximately 40 feet of water at its deepest point. Construction crews working on the dam reported several unsettling incidents. Equipment malfunctions that engineers could not explain. Workers hearing children's voices when no children were present. 3 separate workers refusing to continue employment on the project, citing dreams in which children appeared and told them to leave the valley. One crew supervisor told a reporter from the Pittsburgh Morning Sun in an article published July 8, 1996, that he would be glad when the project was finished because there was something wrong about the place, something that made every worker feel watched and unwelcome. The reservoir, named Bone Creek Lake, opened to the public in 1997. It serves as a water source for several communities and offers recreational opportunities, including boating and fishing. Informational signs posted at the lake mention the area's mining history, but make no reference to the events of 1909. Most visitors know nothing about what lies beneath the water they enjoy. But those with longer memories, those whose grandparents or great-grandparents worked the mines and lived in the camps, still speak quietly about the children who walked into Bone Creek and were never found. They warn their own children and grandchildren to treat the lake with respect, to avoid swimming in certain areas, and never to go near the water alone at night. Divers who have explored the lake's depths occasionally report unusual experiences. One diver, interviewed for a regional magazine article on underwater archaeology in 2003, described discovering remnants of the old mining camp foundations on the lake bottom. As he examined what appeared to be the stone foundation of a dwelling, he heard singing. Not through his ears, he clarified, but inside his head, as if the sound was being transmitted directly into his consciousness. The singing was harmonious and insistent, and it filled him with an overwhelming desire to remove his regulator and breathe the water. He ascended immediately and refused to dive in that location again. Scientific explanations have been proposed for various aspects of the case over the years. Psychologists have suggested that the behavioral changes in the children might have resulted from shared trauma or environmental toxins that affected their neurological function. Geologists have speculated about unusual mineral deposits or underground caverns that might create acoustic phenomena capable of producing the reported singing sounds. Folklorists note the universal nature of legends about malevolent water spirits that lure victims to drown, suggesting that the Bone Creek case might be an American iteration of ancient archetypes found in cultures worldwide. Yet none of these explanations adequately address all the documented facts. The coordination of the children's behavior, the absolute absence of recovered bodies despite extensive searching, the consistent reports across more than a century of anomalous phenomena localized to one specific location, the ancient carvings discovered after the 1951 flood, the modern recordings and photographs that capture seemingly impossible images and sounds. Each piece of evidence individually might be dismissed or explained away, but the accumulation becomes harder to rationalize within conventional frameworks. In 2009, on the 100th anniversary of the children's disappearance, a small memorial service was held at Bone Creek Lake. Family descendants of some of the lost children attended, having maintained the story through generations, even as the broader community forgot. A granite marker was installed near the lake's shore, bearing the names of the 17 children and the simple inscription, "Lost to the Flood, March 17, 1909. The ceremony included prayers in several languages, reflecting the diverse heritage of the mining families. As the service concluded near sunset, several attendees reported hearing faint singing coming from across the water, though no boats or other people were visible on the lake. Local historians continued to investigate the case when resources permit. The Crawford County Historical Society maintains a file on the incident, including photographs, transcripts of the coroner's inquest, copies of Dr. Pemberton's notes, and Robert Ashworth's research materials. Students occasionally write papers on the disappearances, approaching them from perspectives ranging from social history to folklore studies to psychology. The case has been featured in several books on American mysteries and unexplained phenomena, though often in sensationalized form that obscures the carefully documented historical record. What cannot be disputed are the basic facts. 17 children from a mining settlement along Bone Creek walked into floodwaters on March 17, 1909, and were never found. They left behind families destroyed by grief, a community that ultimately abandoned the location, and a legacy of unanswered questions that persist to the present day. Whether their disappearance resulted from natural causes, from environmental factors science has yet to identify, from mass psychological phenomena or from something else entirely, remains unresolved. The children themselves remain where they entered the water, beneath Bone Creek, beneath the lake that now covers the valley where they lived their brief lives. On quiet evenings, when the wind stills and the surface of the water becomes smooth as glass, some claim you can still hear them singing, calling out in languages both familiar and strange, inviting others to join them in the eternal currents that flow beneath the visible world. The case of the children of the flood stands as one of Crawford County's most disturbing historical mysteries, a reminder that even in the early 20th century, in an age of increasing scientific understanding and industrial development, there remained aspects of human experience that defied explanation. The mining camps are long gone now, the shafts sealed, the immigrant families who toiled in darkness dispersed or assimilated into broader American culture. But the children remain suspended in the moment of their disappearance, forever walking into the water, forever vanishing beneath the surface, forever singing their strange harmonies in the depths of Bone Creek. The memorial service of 2009 marked a turning point in how the community engaged with the case. For the first time in decades, researchers gained access to previously sealed documents. The Crawford County Sheriff's Department, in response to requests from family descendants, released additional investigative files that had been stored in their archives since 1909. These files contained witness statements that had not been included in the official coroner's report, statements that painted an even more disturbing picture of the events surrounding the children's disappearance. Among these newly released documents was a statement from Jacob Hoffman, a night watchman employed by the Western Coal and Mining Company. Hoffman had been stationed at Mine 17 on the night of March 16th, positioned in a small guard shack approximately a quarter-mile from the Hollow settlement. His job was to ensure no unauthorized persons entered the mine complex during non-working hours and to watch for any signs of fire or structural problems that might threaten company property. According to his statement, given to Sheriff Hayward on March 19th, but marked as supplementary and not included in the inquest proceedings, Hoffman witnessed something that terrified him so thoroughly he resigned his position the following day. Hoffman stated that at approximately midnight on March 17th, he heard what he initially believed was singing coming from the direction of Bone Creek. This matched the accounts given by residents of the Hollow, but Hoffman's position gave him a different vantage point. He described stepping outside the guard shack to investigate and seeing lights in the water, dozens of them, moving upstream against the powerful current. The lights were pale green and seemed to pulse in rhythm with the singing. As he watched, transfixed by the impossible sight, he saw the children emerge from the settlement and move toward the creek. From his elevated position, he could see both the children on land and the lights in the water, and he observed that the lights moved toward the bank in perfect coordination with the children's approach. Most disturbingly, Hoffman claimed that as the children entered the water, the lights surrounded them, and for a brief moment before they disappeared beneath the surface, he saw that the lights were not inanimate phenomena, but were attached to or emanating from figures in the water. These figures, he stated, were approximately the size of children, but moved in ways that human bodies could not, twisting and bending as they rose from the creek bed to meet the children descending from the bank. The entire event lasted perhaps 2 minutes from the moment the first child entered the water until the last one vanished beneath the surface. Then the lights went out, the singing stopped, and the night returned to normal leaving only the sound of rain and rushing water. Hoffman's statement included a sketch he had drawn of what he witnessed. The sketch shows stick figures in the water with elongated limbs reaching upward toward figures standing at the water's edge. Around the underwater figures, Hoffman had drawn circles representing the lights he saw. When Sheriff Hayward asked why Hoffman had not immediately reported what he witnessed or attempted to intervene, Hoffman replied that he had been paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak until the event concluded. He also stated that he was certain any attempt to interfere would have resulted in his own death, though he could not explain why he felt this way. The question of why this statement was excluded from the coroner's inquest has never been satisfactorily answered. Sheriff Hayward's notes indicate that he considered Hoffman's account too fantastical to present without corroborating evidence, and that he feared it would discredit the investigation by introducing what he termed elements of superstition and hysteria. Whether this decision to exclude evidence constituted a cover-up or a well-intentioned attempt to maintain scientific credibility remains a matter of debate among researchers who have studied the case. Another document released in 2009 was a series of letters between Dr. Harold Pemberton and Dr. Edmund Blackstone, a psychiatrist at the Kansas State Asylum in Osawatomie. These letters, dated from April through August of 1909, reveal that Dr. Pemberton was deeply troubled by his experiences at Bone Creek and sought professional consultation about what he had witnessed. In a letter dated April 15th, Dr. Pemberton described in detail his overnight investigation at the creek and the overwhelming compulsion he felt to enter the water. He asked Dr. Blackstone whether such a compulsion could be explained by hypnotic suggestion, mass hysteria, or some form of psychological contagion that might have affected not only the children, but also adults who spent time near the location. Dr. Blackstone's responses, written in the formal medical language of the period, acknowledged the reality of psychological phenomena that could cause people to act against their survival instincts. He cited documented cases of suicide epidemics in isolated communities, instances of mass delusion, and the power of suggestion in vulnerable populations. However, Dr. Blackstone also noted that the consistency and specificity of the experiences reported at Bone Creek did not fit neatly into established psychiatric categories. In a letter dated June 3rd, Dr. Blackstone wrote that he would like to visit the location himself to conduct observations, but there is no record of such a visit ever occurring. The correspondence between the two doctors concluded in August with a letter from Dr. Pemberton stating that he had decided to leave Crawford County and relocate his practice to Topeka. He wrote that he could no longer treat patients from the mining communities without being reminded of the children who had disappeared under his care, children whose strange symptoms he had documented but failed to understand or prevent. He expressed guilt that he had not taken more aggressive action when the behavioral changes first appeared, though he acknowledged that he had no framework for understanding what was occurring or how to intervene. Dr. Pemberton lived until 1947, but according to family records located by researchers, he never returned to Crawford County and never spoke publicly about the Bone Creek case again. The release of these documents sparked renewed interest in the case among paranormal investigators and academic researchers alike. In 2010, a team from the University of Kansas Department of Folklore conducted extensive interviews with older residents of Crawford County, seeking any oral traditions or family stories related to the incident. They discovered that many families whose ancestors had worked in the mining camps, maintained private beliefs about Bone Creek that they were reluctant to share with outsiders. These beliefs varied in detail, but shared common elements. The water in that location was wrong in some fundamental way. It wanted offerings, particularly of children, and ignoring its demands brought tragedy. One elderly woman, whose grandmother had lived at the hollow, but whose family had left before the flood, told researchers that her grandmother always said the mining company should never have built there because the creek was hungry. According to family tradition, several children had drowned in Bone Creek in the years before 1909 under circumstances that seemed suspicious. A boy who supposedly knew how to swim was found drowned in a shallow pool in 1906. Twin girls wandered away from their home in 1907 and were discovered in the creek despite multiple adults searching the area and supposedly finding no trace of them for hours. In each case, the drownings were ruled accidental, but the families believed something in the water had called their children to it. These earlier deaths, if they occurred as described in oral traditions, were never included in any official accounting of the Bone Creek tragedy. They suggest a pattern of child disappearances in the area extending back at least several years before the mass vanishing of March 1909. Whether these earlier incidents influenced the behavior of the children who disappeared during the flood, perhaps through stories they heard from older siblings or adults, remains impossible to determine. But the possibility raises disturbing questions about whether the children who walked into the water had been psychologically primed by knowledge of previous disappearances, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy driven by fear and cultural expectation. Environmental studies conducted at Bone Creek Lake in 2011 attempted to identify any unusual geological or chemical factors that might explain the reported phenomena. Researchers from Kansas State University collected water samples, analyzed sediment cores, and examined the underlying limestone formations. They discovered several interesting features. The limestone in the area contains an unusually high concentration of calcite crystals that, under certain conditions of water flow and temperature, can produce subtle acoustic resonances. Some researchers speculated these natural resonances might be interpreted as singing or voices, particularly by people already in a heightened emotional state. Additionally, the sediment cores revealed layers of charcoal and burned material at depths corresponding to periods approximately 300 and 800 years in the past, suggesting that significant fires or possibly ceremonial burning had occurred in the valley long before European settlement. Pollen analysis indicated that the vegetation in the valley had changed dramatically several times over the past millennium, possibly due to deliberate landscape management by indigenous peoples. These findings supported the idea that the location had been used for specific purposes by previous inhabitants, though what those purposes were could not be determined from the physical evidence alone. One geological feature that particularly interested researchers was the presence of natural sinkholes and cave systems in the limestone beneath Bone Creek. Ground-penetrating radar revealed extensive underground voids, some large enough to be accessible caves, others smaller fissures and channels through which water flowed. In several locations, these underground channels connected directly to the creek bed, creating places where water on the surface could pour directly into subterranean passages. The researchers noted that in flood conditions, the current at these connection points would be extraordinarily powerful, capable of pulling objects and potentially people into the underground system with tremendous force. This discovery led to a theory that the children's bodies might have been swept into underground channels and carried deep into the limestone cave system, which would explain why they were never recovered despite extensive searching. The theory gained some support from local cave exploration groups, who noted that the underground water systems in Crawford County extend for many miles and connect with cave networks that have never been fully mapped. Bodies drawn into such a system might remain trapped underground indefinitely, inaccessible to searchers working from the surface. However, this geological explanation, while potentially accounting for the missing bodies, did nothing to address the behavioral changes in the children before the flood. The reports of singing and lights, or the apparent coordination of their actions on the night they disappeared. It also did not explain why similar mass drownings had not occurred at other locations with comparable geology during other floods. The cave system theory provided a partial answer, but left the most disturbing aspects of the case unexplained. In 2012, a documentary filmmaker named Rebecca Morrison produced an hour-long film about the Bone Creek incident titled The Singing Waters. The documentary combined historical research, interviews with descendants, reenactments, and footage of the modern reservoir. Morrison gained permission to review all available documents and interviewed several researchers who had studied the case. The film presented multiple perspectives without advocating for any single explanation, allowing viewers to draw their own conclusions about what had occurred. During production of the documentary, Morrison and her crew experienced several incidents they found deeply unsettling. While filming at the lake at dawn, their audio equipment recorded what sounded like children's voices singing, though no children were present at that hour. Analysis of the recording revealed that the voices were not present in the direct microphone feeds, but appeared on the ambient sound recording, suggesting they originated from the environment rather than from equipment malfunction. Morrison also reported that 2 members of her crew refused to continue working on the project after experiencing vivid nightmares about drowning children calling them into the water. The documentary aired on regional PBS stations in 2013 and subsequently became available online, where it attracted significant attention. The comment section of the online version filled with accounts from people who claimed to have had their own experiences at Bone Creek Lake. Multiple visitors reported hearing singing. Several described seeing children in the water who vanished when approached. One man claimed that his daughter, age 8 at the time, had sleepwalked out of their family's tent during a camping trip at the lake and was found standing in the water up to her waist, unresponsive and staring toward the deepest part of the reservoir. When he pulled her out and she woke fully, she had no memory of leaving the tent, but told him she had been dreaming about other children calling her name and asking her to play with them underwater. These modern accounts, impossible to verify but disturbingly consistent with historical reports, suggest that whatever phenomenon was present at Bone Creek in 1909 may still be active in some form. Skeptics argue these contemporary experiences result from people's knowledge of the historical case, creating expectation and causing them to interpret ordinary experiences as paranormal. The power of suggestion, they note, can be remarkably strong, particularly in locations associated with tragedy. When people visit a place knowing its dark history, their perception becomes filtered through that knowledge, making them more likely to notice and remember anything unusual while dismissing or forgetting ordinary experiences. Yet, the consistency of certain details across more than a century of reports is difficult to dismiss entirely. The singing, always described as harmonious and in unknown languages. The lights in the water, pale green and pulsing. The sensation of being called or compelled toward the creek. The figures seen moving beneath the surface with unnatural ease. These specific elements appear in accounts separated by decades, given by people with no connection to each other, describing experiences at a location whose tragic history they may not have known at the time of their visit. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a psychologist at the University of Missouri who has studied the case as part of her research on collective trauma and cultural memory, offers another perspective. In a paper published in 2015, Dr. Chen argued that the Bone Creek incident represents a perfect example of how communities process inexplicable tragedy through narrative construction. According to her analysis, the various supernatural elements associated with the case serve psychological and social functions, allowing people to make sense of senseless loss by attributing it to forces beyond human control or understanding. The singing, the lights, the compulsions, all these elements transform random tragedy into meaningful story, creating a framework through which grief and horror can be expressed and managed. Dr. Chen's interpretation is compelling from a psychological standpoint, but it struggles to account for the documented behavioral changes in the children before the flood, changes observed and recorded by multiple independent witnesses, including medical professionals and educators. These changes were documented before the tragedy occurred, before there was any narrative to construct or any cultural need to explain loss. The children's drawings, their talk of voices beneath the water, their trance-like states. These were not retrospective interpretations, but contemporary observations that remain part of the historical record regardless of how the later disappearance is explained. The question of what should be done about Bone Creek Lake in light of its history remains contentious. Some descendants of the families affected have called for the lake to be drained and the site restored to its natural state, arguing that the location remains dangerous and that the children's remains might still be recovered if the area were properly excavated. Local authorities have consistently rejected these proposals, citing the enormous cost of draining the reservoir and the essential role it plays in the region's water supply system. Others have suggested that the lake should at minimum be clearly marked with historical information about the tragedy, allowing visitors to understand the significance of the place they are recreating in. To date, no such markers have been installed. In 2018, a group calling itself the Bone Creek Memorial Foundation attempted to raise funds for a more substantial memorial at the lake, one that would include the names of all the children, historical information about the mining community, and perhaps a small museum space for artifacts and documents. The foundation organized community meetings and applied for historical preservation grants, but the project stalled due to lack of funding and disagreement about what information should be presented. Some felt the memorial should focus on the mining heritage and the lives of the families, treating the disappearance as tragic but not emphasizing the more disturbing aspects of the case. Others argued that sanitizing the history would dishonor the children's memory and perpetuate a cover-up that began with the coroner's inquest in 1909. The debate reflected broader tensions about how communities remember and memorialize tragedy, particularly tragedies that resist easy explanation and contain elements that challenge consensus reality. How do you honor victims of an event that may have been supernatural in nature without appearing to endorse belief in the supernatural? How do you preserve historical truth when that truth includes testimony about phenomena that violate scientific understanding? These questions remain unresolved, and the Bone Creek Memorial Foundation suspended its activities in 2019 without achieving its goals. Meanwhile, independent researchers continue to study the case, each bringing different methodologies and theoretical frameworks. Folklorists analyze the narrative structure and archetypal elements. Geologists examine the physical environment. Psychologists explore group dynamics and trauma responses. Historians contextualize the event within the broader story of immigration, labor exploitation, and industrial development in early 20th century Kansas. Each discipline offers insights, but none provides complete answers. The case remains fundamentally mysterious, resistant to any single explanatory framework. What cannot be disputed, what remains as stark historical fact beyond interpretation or theory, is this: 17 children walked into Bone Creek on the night of March 17, 1909, and were never seen again. Their names were Magdalena Kovac, Tomasz Nowak, Elena Petrovich, Anton Horvat, Maria Kowalska, Stanislav Dvorak, Anya Petrovich, Josef Kowalski, Kristina Novak, Ivan Juric, Maria Babic, Dragan Kovac, Anna Kowalska, Petar Horvat, Sofia Novak, Luka Dvorak, and Milena Juric. They ranged in age from 4 to 13 years old. They were children of immigrants who had come to Kansas seeking better lives and instead found only hard labor in dangerous mines and the hard-scrabble existence of company-owned camps. They deserved better than they received in life, and they deserved better than to vanish without trace, leaving questions that have haunted their descendants for more than a century. On quiet evenings at Bone Creek Lake, when the wind dies and the water becomes smooth as glass reflecting the sky above and the depths below, some say you can still hear them. 17 voices singing together in harmony, calling out from beneath the surface, forever trapped in the moment of their disappearance, forever young, forever lost, forever singing their strange songs in the dark water. Whether these voices are real or imagined, whether they represent actual paranormal phenomena or merely the echoes of tragedy that live in human memory and refuse to be silenced, may ultimately matter less than the simple act of remembering. 17 children walked into the flood and never returned. That much is true. That much is certain. Everything else, all the theories and speculations and supernatural claims, exists in the space between what we know and what we fear, between documented fact and the stories we tell ourselves about forces beyond our understanding. The children of Bone Creek remain beneath the water, beneath the lake, beneath the accumulated years and layers of history. They remain in the memories of families who still speak their names. They remain in the archival documents carefully preserved in climate-controlled storage. They remain in the oral traditions of Crawford County's old mining communities. They remain in the nightmares of those who visit the lake and feel something ancient and hungry watching them from below. They remain as a reminder that some mysteries do not yield to investigation or explanation, that some tragedies defy resolution, and that some places carry darkness that time does not erase but only buries deeper, waiting beneath the surface for those who know how to listen, to hear the voices singing there forever.